So I'm Tom de Waal. I'm from Carnegie Europe, along with a couple of my colleagues, Rosa and Dimitar, and last year Europe's Futures Fellow. So it's my pleasure and honor to be moderating the first panel, which is going to be about Russia with Kadri, Liik. Last time I knew you were ECFR, I think you still are. European Council on Foreign Relations, and also with Grigorij Mesežnikov and Dimitar Bechev. We have, well, we'll try and, I think we'll try and use our full 90 minutes. I think we'll try and divide this roughly into thirds. About 30 minutes from Kadri, about 30 minutes discussion with the three of us, and then another 30 minutes in which everyone can contribute. I think it's fair to say the history of Russia is never linear. It never goes in a straight line, and those of us who were here last year will recall that we were following almost hour by hour the Grigorij rebellion which was happening in Russia, and suddenly the idea that Putin's regime was stable looked illusory. There was a point when Grigorij was on the march to Moscow. He basically took over the whole city of Rostov without any resistance at all, and then everything suddenly collapsed again. Grigorij had an unfortunate accident about a month later and died, and the illusion of stability was reimposed. But I think that anyone who predicts that Russia proceeds in a straight line and that the Russia of today will be the Russia in even 1 year, 5 years, I think is making, an elementary historical mistake. So like Kadri, I myself, I think, was formed, I think we're of the same generation roughly, by first going to Russia in the mid-1980s as a student, and then working there in the 1990s. I think we had roughly the same career trajectory. I think we were both journalists in Russia in the 1990s, and again, that was a period, again, of incredible upheaval, change, non-linear movement, sometimes thrilling and exciting, sometimes extremely disturbing and violent. But again, I think that's a lesson about the other side of Russia, which we don't see at the moment, but which is all too possible in the future. So I'm really pleased that Kadri has chosen as her topic to look at in some depth at what the perestroika experience, that period in Russian fairly recent history, what it can and can't tell us to expect about Russia's future. So I'll hand over to you, Kadri, and very much look forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I don't know. I have, yeah, does it work? No. Yes? Okay. Yeah, I think your mic is better, but anyway. So, yes, my pleasure to be here. A little scary too, to be sharing my thoughts with you, and I will welcome all feedback because I'm still finalizing my research. I haven't yet started properly writing the paper, so I'd be happy also to harvest ideas from all of you or questions. Maybe I will start by telling you why I chose that topic. It has personal roots for me. And as Tom said, it's true. I started being interested in Russia in mid-80s. I was living in Estonia, but when I first visited Moscow, that was in January 1987, and that was love from the first sight. I sensed that this place is huge and exciting, and I want to come back. I want to understand what what it is, what it contains. And I kept going back. I think actually I have been to Moscow each calendar year ever since. The first one I didn't visit was 22 and then 23. So that war has has brought kind of break also into my personal relationship with Russia. But what I started noticing that Russia often didn't behave the way I expected it to. I think my expectations of Russia were formed in my youth. That was, spent in perestroika-era Soviet Union. In my conversations with Russians, I often even say that, I'm a Soviet intellectual from perestroika period. They like it when I identify myself as such, and I think it's correct. That was a period that formed me, my political instincts, my thinking. I ended up living in a different society, but that's where my internal compass comes from. But Putin's Russia doesn't behave often the way I expect it to, based on those instincts. So I thought I need to look into it and internalize the difference and what makes it different, because otherwise I always end up expecting something more positive and ending up disappointed. Another thing, I thought that I would want to write something about perestroika to Western audiences, because people don't necessarily know what perestroika was about or what it was like. I think it's often defined in a too linear manner as sort of struggle between communism or democracy, or struggle for independence in the republics, or overall time of chaos. I think what's missed out often is how sort of fluid and creative the time was, how rules changed day by day. Something that was not allowed yesterday was allowed today, forbidden again tomorrow, and taken for granted week after. So it really was very, very dynamic in both directions. And in a way, what makes it even more interesting, I feel that right now, it's a similar time in Russia. What was allowed yesterday is not allowed today, might be briefly allowed tomorrow, and completely forbidden week after. So it's moving in the opposite direction, but with sort of undefined change of rules. What's happening is in some ways similar. It's a reverse process. And it was also interesting how in perestroika time, it was, once rules were not the same for everyone. Some restrictions that were valid for some people were not for others. And I'm not talking about, nomenclatura privileges. These were there too. That we know, and that's not very interesting. But often, as I remember, it was possible for people to decide for themselves to what extent did they want to go along with communist crap that was happening, and where did they say no? It was possible, for instance, for poets to say, listen, I don't put up with censorship anymore, I don't care. It was possible to say, I'm not going to join that meeting of Communist Youth League. So basically people could take their own share of freedom at times and get away with it. That was also interesting. I made use of that myself, refusing to wear school uniform. I never got penalized, others did. So that was somehow fascinating. And also, third reason why I wanted to look into it, only not that long ago actually, I realized that perestroika for Russians and for us in the Baltic states were very different. For us, it was a very hopeful time. Even though, there were fears, anxieties, deadlocks, political struggles, but what underpinned it all was the hope, to get proper autonomy, to keep our languages, our nationhood, and maybe even restore full independence. For Russians, it was much more ambivalent. And when I have been reading Russian memories of perestroika-era, actually, they sensed catastrophe early on. I think, I mean, many people's diaries from 1990 are basically very pessimistic. You know, it's all gonna collapse. Nothing can be done. And that spans people from politics to other walks of life. I mean, that's what I see in Chernyaev's memoirs. He was aide to Gorbachev, who has published his diaries later on. But that is also comes from sort of theater directors, etc. And overall, it was more ambivalent. You know, for us, it was movement towards normality. For a long time, to me, it was. For a long time, I thought that, you know, this is how life works. That's a natural process. You are born, then you change teeth when you are 6 or so. Then you reach puberty at 12 or 13, and when you are 21, a totalitarian state collapses around you, and you are ready for a grown-up life. That's the process. And it was so natural for me, and it was, in a way, interesting to see that it was something else for Russians entirely. So I wanted to look at that. And I'm really very grateful for fellowship and IWM that you have allowed me to do that, because I don't think my employer would have approved such a backward-looking research as part of my work plan. So now about my findings, such as they are, and they are, I'm afraid, somewhat bleak. For a long time, I felt that, okay, maybe that was not such a good idea to undertake that research at all, because the answer is very short. What enabled democratization under perestroika was Gorbachev. It was very top-down. It was started by Gorbachev. It was his personal initiative. I don't think there were any meaningful society-wide structural reasons. Society didn't properly come along with it. That is another thing that, for me, coming from the Baltics, it took a long time to internalize, because in the Baltic state, society was behind it. Baltic national movements were true national movements. I dare to say 80 or 90% of societies in the Baltic states certainly subscribed to it. Not so in Moscow, not so in Russia. What Levada Center sociologists always have told me, that it was a shallow, if intensive process involving the political top. The deep layers of society somewhere far away in the provinces never came along with it. They remained bystanders. At best, they may have given benefit of the doubt. At worst, they remained suspicious from the start. And now that I have been doing my interviews, I talked to Marju Lauristin, one of my university professors, and sociologist herself, and one of the people who has been member of both Congress of People's Deputies as well as European Parliament. And I asked about perestroika, and she said, but that was, not much was happening. It was a very small group of people trying to do things, and everyone else resisted or was indifferent. There is really not much to talk about. And also, what also struck me, again, someone from the Levada Center told me how when Soviet Union collapsed or after the August coup, freedom came, freedom won. What Yuri Levada had said, it happened too easily. They will not keep it. So, again, it didn't go deep enough in the society, and society had not proper buy-in. I tried to look at societal forces that still contributed to perestroika. And there, of course, are some. You had intelligentsia, and many of them were a force for democracy. And and that's one difference with today. I think intelligentsia was more of a force in the Soviet Union than it is today. They were people with some authority, listened by the society, but also by powers that be. They did play a role, and it's not so today. I think today, yes, I mean, there are some cultural figures who command some authority, but I don't think they are in any position to dictate terms to the Kremlin. Kremlin is not afraid of them, or doesn't stare back from trying to discredit them. And also, the role of technical intelligentsia is also interesting, because sometimes also in the Soviet Union, people who worked sort of, I don't know, as engineers or economists, or they could see that the Soviet system was rotten and something needed to be done. And they actually, from, not from the sort of general humanitarian principles, but from their own technical or technocratic background, they became supporters of perestroika. And I look at today's Russia and I wonder, we had those debates with some Russians about technocrats in today's Russia. What's their position? Where will they end up? And I remember one person telling me that, listen, you cannot make technocrats to do anything. I mean, they serve Putin's Russia, but there are limits, and they have their own ethical positions. And I wonder what he would say now. He's outside the country. He has left Russia for Kazakhstan. And technocrats actually serve Putin's war machine. So they have not, so far at least, played a role of political a political role in trying to insert some ethical standards or something like that to the regime. Then, one other thing that I think played a role in Soviet perestroika and that is no longer there is the Soviet Union. Perestroika was happening in the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union was something different from independent Russia. But again, that's something I take from Yuri Levada himself. I went to interview him in the turn of a century, I think. I was still working in Moscow, and he was still head of Tsiom before that was overtaken by the state. And I was writing an article about the role of the Baltic states in the Soviet Union. And so I wanted to interview sociologists, I wanted to interview dissidents for whom the Baltic states were natural allies. And then I went to see musicians, because for them also the Baltic states were sort of window that brought in Western music through Finnish television, etc. So there were connections with these three groups. And I went to interview Yuri Levada, and the first thing he told me was, I am very sad that the Baltic states have left, because the political processes that used to move on when the Baltic states were still on board have now become to stand still. They don't move at all, or they move very slowly. And according to him, the Baltic states were some kind of catalysts for political processes, some kind of ferment that made things move faster. And I think there is some truth in it. I mean, of course, the Baltic states, they were, maybe a force for democracy, though, I mean, we were that in a bad faith in a way. I mean, we wanted democracy so that we could leave. We didn't really care about democratizing Russia as such. I mean, but I think somehow other nationalities played a role of catalyst or ferment, and maybe not even the Baltic states. I think sort of Russians found it easier to function as a political nation when surrounded by, I don't know, Baltics on the one hand, Central Asians on the other hand. And you can see how, political processes in Putin's Russia are often stillborn or aborted soon. I mean, protests on Bolotnaya, they in the end led to nothing. People were expecting Putin to introduce some change in 2018 to show signs when he's going to leave. That led to nothing. So inertia is much stronger indeed than in the Soviet Union. In retrospect, I even understand why George Bush Sr. may have wanted to keep the Soviet Union together, and even with the Baltic states, because from that point of view, it made sense. We in the Baltics take it very personally as a hostile act against us. And another thing that mattered, that existed then and doesn't exist now, is a concept of future. Today's Russia does not have a concept of future at all, any kind. There was an article, again, by the Levada Center about it not so long ago, and I think only 20% of Russians said that they imagine what life will be like in 15 years' time. And importantly also, people were either the ones who will likely be dead in 15 years' time, the very old generation, or alternatively wealthy people who will have their personal means to affect their personal future in 15 years' time. All the rest of society, they have no idea what life will be like. But Soviet Union had a concept of future. Even too. I mean, there was sort of official Soviet future, communism and so forth. And that was actually important because that made the establishment more accountable. The government was not supposed to discredit communism. They had to show that communism is force for good, can deliver for people, etc. And they adhered to nominal dogmas. And that allowed actually people or forces for democracy to play around with it. I mean, you could take a quote of Lenin and use it to justify something that was not very Leninist at all. It did matter, and later, of course, there was that notion of post-communist future, whatever shape it took. But again, that was also something. But now, erosion of future started long ago. I think when the idea of democratic future died, and that happened maybe sometime during the 90s, I think. It has been absent, but that absence is sort of ever more prominent. And you can feel it. You can actually even feel it in urban landscapes. I remember sitting in a park next to International Trade Center in Moscow. It's a nice old park, and that had been freshly renovated, and people were cycling and enjoying themselves, eating ice cream. And somehow I felt that it's suffocating. It was a nice fresh summer evening, but it felt suffocating. And when I thought about another park in my long ago neighborhood, Waal, Northern River Harbor, there is a very socialist park. It's of socialist sportsmen sculptures. And I realized that my old park was designed to make people think that socialism is superior to other forms of life. And the current park is designed to make people think less in general. Enjoy more, think less. And and that was something I could feel, and I felt better in the socialist park than in the hedonistic Putinist park in central Moscow.
5 minutes till half an hour.
Oh, already. Yeah. So, And I've been trying to think, what does all that tell us about the future? I mean, these parallels are mostly pessimistic. Things that facilitated democratization during perestroika-era, they are no longer around. We cannot rely on them. And today's Russia is actually in quite unusual shape for Russia itself as well. I mean, personalist rule is more overwhelming than it has been any time since Stalin. But also the FSB junta, or the security services prevalence among the elites. I think that is, I don't know, Tom, I think that's first time. Something quite like that we have not seen. So the question is, can that system perpetuate itself? Can it have long life? And frankly, I do not know. I mean, I have been expecting it. My instinctive answer would be no, but then again, that's the perestroika intellectual in me saying no. Maybe actually it's yes. I do not know. They have done a lot better than I have expected. Someone in Moscow suggested that there is a sort of bigger cyclical dynamic in Russian history, that always when you have competition between state and society, society is creative, society creates some value, some resources, then the state takes over, starts using these resources, and when everything is exploited, they introduce a new economic policy, more freedoms again, more entrepreneurship in order to create more new resources. So maybe it comes to that, maybe they will consume everything that lives, and then they feel the need to give up and then let new grass grow, because otherwise it's a barren landscape. I do not know, will that happen, or how far we are from it. The good things, though, there are some. I think Russian society today includes people who are skilled in running economy, running a country, and it has informed part of society that would have demand for democratic change. And that is actually also unlike perestroika, and that's one of the things that is maybe slightly better today, because in perestroika era, those who supported democracy, they were sort of intellectuals who had no clue actually about how state system needs to work or how state economy needs to work. The sort of general humanitarian pathos, lovely, wonderful, and noble, but it wasn't skilled in running the economy. And later on they felt it. I remember myself, I once went with Yuri Afanasyev to a birthday party of Democratic Union, Democratический Союз, the sort of first democratic party in Russia, and it was 2006, deep Putinist time. We walked in, and everyone came to greet Afanasyev, and he took me aside and said that these are all very nice people and impossible to control, or impossible to guide, totally chaotic. And you could see it. It wasn't informed policy making. Or if you read, politicians' memoirs, or even Vladislav Zubok's book about collapse of the Soviet Union, if you read about economic reforms, it actually breaks my heart to understand how they had no clue what they were doing. It really was disaster. Whereas now, Russia has these technocrats who have learned how to handle inflation, monetary supply, fiscal policy, things. They are fairly good on it. So if someone came who felt need for top-down democratization, there would be constituency for him to rely on. And also on society. I think there are people among small businesses or professionals who feel that democracy is needed, for their everyday life. So, for them, democracy would not be a lofty ideal borrowed from the West, but a real life need. I don't think I think we often think in terms of false analogies. We expect either Russia to collapse the way the Soviet Union did. I don't think it will. Or we expect Russia to, start it all over, go back to 91 and undertake the sort of path of democratization the rest of Eastern Europe went through. I don't think that will happen either. If democracy takes root in Russia in the future, it will have sort of different roots and different constituencies it builds on. But in some ways, it can be that these constituencies will be bigger, will be stronger because, not bigger, they will still be small, but they could be stronger because for them, it will be a practical personal need and informed decision, choices they have felt rather than lofty ideals. But then, of course, Gorbachev happened because Soviet establishment felt that they were inferior to the West, and they looked up to the West. They didn't want to be Soviet savages next to the West. I don't know if any future leader, a Russian leader, will feel the same way, because the West doesn't carry the same kind of prestige. Not the same image. They don't even have language to talk about democracy because much of sort of Western democracy language has been discredited in Russia. They would need to invent new vocabulary, new concepts to talk about it. And I think, for anything like that to happen, I think the West really also needs to get our act together and reform ourselves and make democracy a properly functioning system in Western society. And maybe to finish, another memorable quote from a conversation I had with, again, someone, a fairly prominent imperialist mind in Moscow. We talked in 2017, when, after Brexit vote, all Moscow was a buzz about European Union soon collapsing because, of course, it will collapse. Britain has already left. And I told them that, I don't think so. And told them of conversations I had picked up in Paris and Berlin. And then I had an interview with that person who told me how Europe is marginal, how the future is in Great Eurasia, cooperation with China, etc. Gave his sort of very ironic, sardonical talk. And then towards the end, he looked at me and said, but so how is life in that Western periphery of Great Eurasia? And I told him what I'm picking up in Europe, what's happening, what people are thinking. And then he told me very, very quietly, but seriously, listen, of course you need to overcome your problems, because otherwise we will never overcome ours. And I think he was right. He said that of course you need to overcome your problems, because otherwise we have no chance of overcoming ours.
Thank you so much, Kadri. You've confirmed, I think, what many of us knew already, that there's few observers of Russia who go so deep as you do. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I have two questions, and then I'll give Dimitar and Grigorij a chance. Talking of anecdotes, a few months ago I was at a session with Bridget Kendall, the veteran BBC correspondent, and she had an anecdote of some Putinist official saying to her, yes, we like China, but ultimately we're never going to eat with chopsticks. She's this is, I think, is a kind of personal ideological dilemma for the Putinist elite. Eurasia sounds very nice, but they don't want to eat with chopsticks.
I had another one on the same topic. Someone said that a flying fish can fly, but it actually belongs in water.
So I have two questions / observations for you, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues. One is about the economy, and about that basically perestroika was needed because the Soviet economy had basically stopped working. And that's why reform was needed. That's why Gorbachev was chosen. It wasn't delivering for ordinary people. They couldn't get basic consumer goods. The command economy didn't deliver for them. And the nomenclatura was not happy either. They could look around the world and see that all they had was non-monetary privileges, whereas people in corresponding elites lived in nice fancy houses, had nice fancy holidays in the West, and why shouldn't they have something similar? And another anecdote for you, because in 1995, March 1995, which was the 10th anniversary of Gorbachev coming to power, I was a young journalist in Moscow, and I had the luck of being one of 6 Western journalists who accompanied Gorbachev on a trip to Novosibirsk in Siberia. I think Gorbachev was beginning to, using this as a sort of moment to test the weather, to see whether he could re-enter politics, which he later did a year later, and I think only got 1% in the 1996 elections. But there were lots of, so we spent several days with Gorbachev in Novosibirsk, which was also the great academic center of the Soviet Union. And there was repeated questions to him about, well, you wanted economic reform. You know, what about the Chinese model, that you could reform the economy while keeping the political system intact? And Gorbachev said, that sounds very nice, but here in Novosibirsk, in Akademgorodok, which was the most advanced intellectual center, we thought, of the Soviet Union, and I think he named the figure 64. We had 64 reports about how to reform the economy, and they were all very superficial. None of them mentioned China, not a single one. There was no model for us to follow. That was his answer to that question. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think perestroika was driven by a failing economy? And of course, I suppose there could be the follow-up question, to what extent, with the Putin regime also, could it survive a collapsing economy? So let me start with that one.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I'm not an economist, of course, but my understanding is that Soviet Union, had they not started reforming it could have continued existing, though not in a great shape, for a while more. So need was not so urgent. I think Gorbachev's personal desire to change things was what played a role. And it's actually very interesting. I have asked Gorbachev exactly the same question you mentioned. I interviewed him in August 2001, so the 10th anniversary of the coup attempt, and I asked him, why didn't you do Chinese model? Okay, perestroika was necessary, but why did you have classrooms? Because you must have realized that if everyone had the right to say what they think, then obviously the Baltic states will sooner or later spell out that we never wanted to be part of the Soviet Union in the first place. And he told me that, I needed something from me. No, it's okay. Maybe I shouldn't meddle with it. Better? So anyway, what Gorbachev said was, I needed the support of the people, because otherwise the Communist Party would have sidelined me the way they sidelined Khrushchev. And that was a reply that actually made sense. And according to him, that was why he started political reforms and glasnost, new thinking in order to bring society to back the reform process, which was not a full success for him, let's say so.
Plenty more to say on that, particularly modern parallels, but let me ask my second question, which is about ideology. I think it's another Levada person. Is it Yuri Levinson? Is he Levada?
Alexei Levinson.
Alexei Levinson, excuse me. So he's written a lot about how Russian, the kind of Putinist identity is basically a negative identity. It doesn't have anything positive to offer. It's defensive. It looks to the past. It basically relies on the fact that the West wants to destroy us, and therefore we have to defend ourselves. And I think he uses the phrase negative identity. And so again, when one looks back in Russian history, most leaders had a positive idea. Gorbachev certainly did, and Yeltsin certainly did. So again, that's a kind of question mark as to what is Putin trying to look for a positive message, and is that something which can get him popular legitimacy, or to what extent is his popular legitimacy founded completely on a negative identity, which of course is subject to events beyond his control?
I think his negative identity is very, or I think his political power based on that negative message is actually very strong, and potentially stronger than it could be if it were based on positive message. I mean, I just talked also with Levinson a few days ago, and he told me about polls about the war, and majority of Russian society backs the war effort, but they're also happy to end the war if Putin so says. So, they sort of delegate decision-making power to Putin, and Putin for them becomes a symbol of something. But, if Putin agrees, we can do that and that and that. If Putin agrees, we can give Donbass back. If he doesn't, then no, we will die for Donbass. It's that kind of delegation of decision-making to Putin. And I think, it probably helps that Putin doesn't have positive agenda, because otherwise, you could scrutinize if he delivers, and maybe he doesn't. But now, and Putin himself, of course, tries to, he now tries to portray Russia as a fortress of traditional values, etc. But also has some success, even though, it started out as a way to marginalize urban intelligentsia after 2011, after the Bolotnaya protests, because Putin could see that they don't back him any longer, so he needed to marginalize them in the eyes of the rest of the society. It was fairly cheap political trick at the time. And probably I think the Kremlin may have been surprised themselves to see that actually that found adherents in Europe, among Marine Le Pen's and other such people, and that's when they made it sort of their global strategy or the Western strategy at least. And now, I think some people in Russia believe it, that if you travel to Europe, they will forcefully change your gender or something like that. It's getting fairly caricature in their minds. And these are fairly basic things, so I wouldn't, and Russia is fairly sort of male chauvinist country in these terms. So I wouldn't also underestimate that, though it definitely falls short of sort of positive. It's sort of defensive and against something kind of ideology, but yes, I agree with your point, but I don't think that's necessarily liability to Putin.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I would start from my personal story. I was born in Russia, in Soviet Union, in the central part of European part of Russia, so territory of Russia, and then I married during my student years with a Czechoslovak citizen and my former wife, and I de facto emigrated to Czechoslovakia in 1981. So it means that I was I was observing perestroika from outside. And I remember how, it was occupied country. It was occupied country by the Soviet Union. It wasn't the full military occupation because Soviet troops, they were located in particular areas, but it was politically occupied country since invasion in 1968. And I was following how people in that time in Czechoslovakia was enthusiastic concerning the perestroika. First time in my life, I saw people who were staying in queue for Soviet newspapers, journals, weeklies, monthlies, in the special shop selling international press. Before I only, on Friday, I saw queues to this shop for Austrian communist newspaper Volksstimme because they were publishing TV program for the next week of Austrian television, yeah? But the government was very conservative, very orthodox, de facto neo-Stalinist, and they were very nervous when Gorbachev started to present all these ideas. And in 1987, they even protested unofficially, as I heard, to the Soviet Union that Soviet newspapers started to mention Dubček in positive manner. So Dubček was absolutely tabooed in that time Czechoslovakia, but then Velvet Revolution came and development in Czechoslovakia was much more ahead than what was happening that time in Soviet Union, this perestroika. Kadri, you made excellent observations about peculiarity of perestroika. That it was top-down process, these changes, really every day were changes in conditions when political regime was weakening. So it was kind of signal to the population that now probably it's possible to do, it will be allowed. Now the situation is completely different. Before this panel, I checked the latest opinion polls conducted by Levada Center. It's so depressive. The level of passivity of the Russian population today really is incomparable with the enthusiastic approach of people during perestroika. But I think that it's connected with the fact that the regime is so consolidated. If you compare now Putin's regime and Gorbachev's governance, two completely different things. So yeah, and it's, of course, it's very unfortunate how Russian society changed during the last 30 years, but the question is, really, the country changed beyond the recognition if we are taking situation in the broader historic context. Because I think, and I share your skeptical and pessimistic de facto conclusions about the results of perestroika. I think that perestroika was the episode in either Soviet or Russian history, which wasn't very typical. So now Russia is unfortunately returning to some historic social forms, maybe in modern circumstances, modern conditions, but now we can easily compare what is happening in this country with what was happening, what were the main trends in development, if it was development, let's say, in the pre-communist time. When, Russian monarchy, this imperialist syndrome, efforts to rule other nations, to suppress any expressions of disagreement. So from this point of view, I think that what now we are witnessing is something which shouldn't surprise us. And we can find the elements in political culture today which are very reminiscent of these elements from the previous historic periods. I think that we should now characterize the state. What kind of society, what kind of state now we see in Russia. And this is something which, again, I'm repeating, it's something which reminds us the pre-communist, but also the communist time when, I mean, the state is aggressive geopolitically, very oppressive toward people who disagree with the regime. Yeah, now it's not open dictatorship, but it's a hybrid dictatorship. Now this regime simply, even if we are proceeding from results of opinion polls, I mean, this regime doesn't need massive repressions. It's enough for them to conduct some selective repressions, some personal, I mean, targeting people, and then the population then, I mean, looking to this is simply losing any will to be, I mean, in disagreement. The interesting issue is how the West was treating perestroika, first Gorbachev and then Yeltsin. And I think that maybe West made a huge mistake when it took this perestroika without any trade-offs in good sense. And by the way, I think that one of the peculiarities of this process was that de facto Gorbachev and on perestroika's leadership, they didn't have the real concept of changes. Because a lot of different documents were published, released, approved by that time Central Committee of the Communist Party or maybe some other groups, some good analysis, but I think that they missed the real concept of changes. And I know that even in Czechoslovakia, during the Prague Spring, the Communist Party, I mean the reformist part of Communist Party at the time, they adopted the action program of Prague Spring. And I mean, it was elaboration of the needed steps. Of course, it was still in the framework of the regime. But I mean, that time, these people realized that really they needed something like this. And I think that, and this action program was targeted by Kremlin, by Soviet Union, by Soviet agents inside communist leadership of Czechoslovakia. And unfortunately, invasion stopped this process. But Gorbachev had, I mean, many opportunities to present something which would be politically supported, politically relevant, and also supported by the population. But simply, somehow, these people failed to do this. But now back to the West. And then the Western countries made the mistake that they absolutely unambiguously supported Gorbachev after Gorbachev, Yeltsin, not asking something, I mean, in exchange. So predictability of development, common maybe control. I mean, if you are giving money, then you have to have certainty that this money will be spent in a plausible manner, that it will really help to promote reforms. Nothing like this happened, and then Putin after Yeltsin, but I think that also during the Yeltsin's regime, I mean, the promises simply remained the promises. Russia, even during the Yeltsin's regime, was continuing in some steps which were not very friendly to the West. So just now we are thinking what to do if miracle will happen and Putin will be removed and Russia will return to the more or less civilized manner in foreign policy, what to do with this country. And I think that the West shouldn't repeat this mistake. Now, another thing which is in the current context important, I mean, how to treat Russia if something will change and will weaken the regime. And I mean, reading some analytical papers written by the Western experts, I see how people are fearful of what will happen if this regime will start to weakening, and it will lead to fragmentation of Russia, disintegration of Russia. And frankly, I see here the problem, because the most dangerous this state is when it's consolidated, when power is concentrated. So this state is geopolitically most aggressive when it enjoys this, consolidated form. So all these fears that after removal, potential removal, or maybe physical demise of Putin, or maybe some other changes, that it will lead to civil war or some other unfortunate development, disintegration, and then it will be loss of control in Russia, control of over the nuclear weapons and so on. I think that these are not very helpful, considerations.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
We've already covered so much ground. Get Kadri to respond. Maybe you can come again later.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you touch upon some things that I have been thinking a lot about myself. Western support to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And in a way, Yeltsin already reversed perestroika in some ways. Lilia Shevtsova has put it very well, but Gorbachev did away with historical personalist Russian rule system. He gave up on personal rule, while he never gave up on communism. He actually kept reading Lenin, I think, until the day he died. Whereas Yeltsin did away with communism, but restored the personalist rule. So in a way, government model got reversed very fast and almost without anyone changing. They didn't have a plan, but I don't think West had any. I often think, could we have helped Russia more? Because I think, the poverty in 1990s, and some provinces really were poor, and sort of, it's no good, if you have neighbor killing a neighbor for a bucket of potatoes. That leaves a trauma that discredits political order that allowed that to happen. Could we have helped more? But I don't see how. Had the West given more economic aid, that would have been stolen. You should have insisted on actually running the country. And who would have wanted to do that, or who in Russia would have allowed that? That would have been against the pride, West taking over management of Russia. So that is really tragic. And I think, of course, Western help or Western advice was sometimes also inept. In retrospect, the whole Chicago School of Economists, I'm not sure that was good advice. And probably, what maybe you should have done is, muddled through on some kind of ad hoc basis, not reformed everything simultaneously, but, put thought of country as a family, main thing that people are alive. And, not just the most productive people, not just husband and sons, but also grandmother and the cat. They need to survive the change as well. So maybe that would have created a better atmosphere in society, longer term, more conducive to democracy. But then again, I do not know. It is hard to predict. Us thinking about Russia collapsing, I take an agnostic view. I think it is not very likely to happen, and I don't think we can do anything about it. If it's about to happen, then we cannot prevent it. But it will not happen the way Soviet Union collapsed, because today's Russian republics, they are differently set up. They don't have those kinds of elites, those kinds of aspirations, even national republics. I have been talking to many of them because, we are Finno-Ugrics, so that means Estonians and Finns used to meet with Maris, Udmurts, Karelians, Komis, a whole plethora of Finno-Ugric republics in Russia. And they don't really want independence. Estonians tried to talk them into it. That's true too, but they don't think of themselves in that way, and I can understand if I look back at how Estonia was thinking of itself before the First World War. I don't think we also thought that we need to be independent. And after February Revolution, there was debate in Estonia, should we seek autonomy or should we try to democratize country as a whole? And country as a whole meant Tsarist Russia. And only after Bolshevik Revolution, the majority in Estonia decided that enough is enough. Now we need to go. So they're conscious, they think of themselves as part of Russia quite often. And of course you can have, I don't know, Caucasus, what will Chechnya do after, if Russia is shaken in some ways and upheavals happen? I don't know, but also, what will Chechnya do if they cannot extort money from Moscow any longer? I don't know, but anyway, so yeah, I don't think that is anything we can affect. So better not lose sleep on that. But Czechoslovakia, that's very interesting what you say, and that is also something that people often forget. That actually, perestroika started from Moscow, and then it moved to the Baltic states. Baltic states had their singing revolution. Singing revolution in Estonia peaked in 1988. And that was before much anything started to happen in much of Eastern Europe. Regimes were collapsed later. So I remember when the anniversary of the collapse of Berlin Wall was celebrated, and people wrote that that was a blow to the Soviet Union. Not necessarily. The Soviet establishment may have thought that, okay, finally they are doing something. Finally, these laggards are not only expecting us to support their communist regimes, but they are actually engaging in some true democracy. So I'll try to see if I can include some of that into my paper, because I think, that record, not that it needs to be set straight, professional people know it, but in public memory, I think things have become blurred.
Yeah, thanks for both of you for the presentation. It almost sent me on a trip down the memory lane, because I was coming of age those years in the 16th Republic, and my experience was very similar to your, Grigorij. All of a sudden, Soviet newspapers, Soviet magazines, Soviet television became very interesting, and I'll come back to the television point later on. But just to follow up on what Kadri said, this is an important dimension in transnational politics of perestroika. And it wasn't a one-way street. Of course, we now look at how Moscow impacted the periphery, be it Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, or what have you. But it started the other way around, because Gorbachev had been a roommate, some of those people who made the Prague Spring possible, right? It's not, yeah, exactly, Minaj. So it's not coincidental they mentioned or referenced Dubček. So contagion was going in this direction. And also Yugoslavia is relevant here, since we are gathered in Croatia. Gorbachev had a prominent visit to Yugoslavia, where the self-management model was thought of as one other example of a communism or Leninism with a human face. So you actually have a mixed system which is fairly pluralistic, but also adheres to the tenets of the communist creed. And of course that's a supreme irony, because at the time, late 80s, Yugoslavia was a basket case. IMF program, high unemployment, the whole shebang of economic problems, very different, of course, compared to the Soviet Union, but the model was not necessarily in its prime in this part of Europe either. Well, Jeffrey Sachs, to open the Jeffrey Sachs chapter, Jeffrey Sachs these days is with Tucker Carlson. So the show horse that happened in Moscow with Zhirinovsky, and Zyuganov now is playing out in the Western public sphere with the far right and Jeffrey Sachs. liberals coming together. But that's a separate conversation. But yeah, I mean, it's a two-way street with the transnational aspects, and probably it's worth exploring. Because the Soviet Union was an ecosystem, and it was this outer empire which really matters. There are all kinds of connections. That's number one. Number two, on the popular buy-in perestroika, I think that's really important because, yeah, I mean, it might have been an elite project, but it happens at a time when actually society is fairly modernized. You have television everywhere, right? I mean, Arkady Ostrovsky's book is very interesting in that respect. That revolution was televised. It played out in TV studios and it was disseminated. The whole Glasnost project, that you can reopen the crimes of Stalinism. It happened in TV studios and people could relate to that, could phone in. And it goes on in the 90s. Putin is a TV phenomenon. Nobody would know who that gray man was if he was not shown on camera. And it created the semblance of a popular dynamic, even if maybe at the grassroots level there was more of the same. So that's probably one thing to consider. And I think also on the economy side, yeah, because there was no economic plan, there was no Deng Xiaoping and well thought through, but the strategies of everyday operators setting up economic cooperatives, right? I mean, there was an opportunity, there was opening in the economy. And of course, you have people, entrepreneurial people in Moscow, Tbilisi, or what have you, who seize on the opportunity to set up businesses, of course, to use bribery and the informal, the gray sector, which was always there in the Soviet system, and to make a buck in the new conditions. So it's not a binary situation. Yeah, I mean, they had this political program, but the economic program was lacking. I think there was an economic story to be told. It might have not worked, but what happened in the 90s was unleashed in the 2000s. Now, my other point, and maybe the last one, is about what perestroika tells us about today's Russia or even the future. The parallel many people draw these days is the 1970s, right? Brezhnevism. So you have an aging leader, stagnant economy, even if the Russian economy on paper now is on steroids, on the back of the war effort, is growing. But still, I mean, the projections for productivity, for innovation are very dire in Russia. So you can have the 1970s parallel. West in disarray, crisis, lack of confidence in the West. The Soviet Union being aggressive, expanding in various parts of the global South. So there are lots of interesting parallels to the 1970s. So the question then is what follows after the repeat 70s? Is it perestroika? I'm not sure because, of course, I agree with you, this same dynamic is not there. Society is much more demoralized. There was conformism, fragmentation, you name it. Or maybe some other period. I'm not sure the Imperial Russia is the main benchmark because, I mean, late Imperial Russia, there was a democratic dynamic. You had political parties emerging, you had the first...
In the last stage.
Yeah,
in the last stage,
you had,
last 10 years, 12 years.
You have the first legislatures. I mean, there was a future in the late Imperial Russia that was democratic, maybe more pluralistic. So democratic in the sense of the German Empire. There was autocratic leader, but there was popular participation. I don't think that's the case now in Russia. But I was thinking, since you mentioned Khrushchev, there was this other opening in the 1950s. So Stalin dies, and of course Stalin is sort of a role model for Putin. And there was an opening, it's incomplete, of course, because there were countervailing forces. To what extent that goal might bring us some parallels. And final thought, one interesting bit about perestroika is, again, this democratic vibe that you have to have popular participation, right? You have to have buy-in. So classic Putinism is an authoritarian regime which relies on demobilization. You mind your own business, enjoy your popular culture, prosperity, don't bother about politics. But this stage of Putinism, because it cosplays totalitarianism, it has this chip on its shoulders. It wants to be a repeat of Stalinism. With the war effort, you actually need to have people enthusiastic about things. They need to be patriotic. They need to engage. And that's probably an interesting parallel because Gorbachev's vision was about bringing society on board. The new Putin vision is also somehow also connected to bringing society on board. I'm not sure it will work, of course, because like you said, there's passivity. You wage the war, we are behind you. You sign the peace, we are also behind you. Lip servicing and so on and so forth. So that's probably an interesting parallel, this dynamic between the state or the leader and society, and this need to mobilize the masses and failure to do so. So I'll leave it here and pass it over to you.
One factual remark. Effects of perestroika, just to remind that in the summer of 1990, Czechoslovakia was the initiator of dissolution of Warsaw Treaty and the Council of Common Economic Cooperation. Yeah, and then it was during perestroika, so Gorbachev still was in charge. So, and then Soviet Union lost even formal channel to influence development in the so-called Allies country. Yeah? Then, of course, Soviet troops, they were in Czechoslovakia till the summer 1991. But I think it was very important that, these countries showed to de facto Gorbachev that our changes are much more ahead, so they are much more deep. So it was really introduction of the liberal democratic model of society.
Well, there was Kadri, Gulash communism, which was...
But it was before.
There was Solidarność as well, so there are a lot of things moving in that direction.
Yeah.
So, Kadri, back to you. We'll run a little over because we started late, and I also do want to get some... Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. So why don't we hold Dimitar's comments and then take some 3 comments, questions from the floor. I see Heather. I see Ivana, Rosa. So why don't we take that and then, okay.
Thanks, this has been really interesting.
I think very helpful at this point to have this historical perspective to start us off. I wanted to ask about the parallel from the post-Putin period and also from the 2011, 2012 period, the triangle between economy, society, and political regime, and how that has shifted. So I think what's really interesting about, you're talking about perestroika and glasnost, which we mean that for perestroika, well, yes, to an extent you did, because otherwise you can't make things important. It's really difficult to do. And the Kremlin can't actually do these things on its own. And I think that was also the case, clearly in the 2011-2012 period, when it did constitute really real attempts, declared attempts to do serious structural reform and actually create middle class, create entrepreneurship, and really change the Russian economy from resource exporting, into different countries. And he ultimately failed because the popular support was not there, and the elite support wasn't really there, because the elites were still investing in aluminium.
Fossil fuels and the rest of it.
But I think what's really interesting is now we see Putin is running a war economy, which keeps him in power because he's fully in control of the economy. He has never control of the oligarchs, certainly in this period, and he doesn't have popular support because of the fact that the war causes a different kind of mobilization. You know, talking about that a lot of the objectives of mobilization aren't quiet, but there is this nationalistic sentiment that keeps them mobilized, but not too much, keeps them at a certain level. So my question is about whether the war economy is sustainable enough as a political project. A lot of the economists working on Russia are saying this will only continue for another 18 months, another 2 years. You might remember that the economists' perspective of for communism was because the economy ran to the top to support the Cold War. It was radiating to communism by forcing the sort of things to place so much on arms. Is that what could happen now? Is that the next scenario? Or is the war economy essentially deliver enough to the population that they will remain demobilized, or is there an economic damage to this country?
Great. Fantastic. I'm going to take three because, so Ivana,
Yes.
take the microphone.
I found this subject very close to my heart because I'm one of political studies and spent a lot of time working years in the Boston when I just about what can be done and watching them all being exiled from Russia and not being able to do anything because they're exiled from just the Russians, but they're all Russians, not people who can contribute to such a society is very, I think, problematic concept that we agreed upon here. My question is about your title, Democratization in Russia. What does the perestroika experience tell us about post-Putin future? If we take perestroika as a period where Russia wanted to reform, let's say, wanted to accept, I don't know, the planet history wanted to accept democracy, capitalism, you name it. And now we have an opposite situation. It is what has that core economy and everything, but now Putin is trying, I don't know, like in 1970, the idea was established. Now he's trying to impose this idea and change the rest of the world. So can Russia be the one which will change the others at the end of this?
Great. Rosa.
I have a question, but I wonder whether it could be a suggestion. Maybe, I don't know. And I mean, it strikes me how important history is in Putin's propaganda, and how, I mean, obviously it's a selective, very selective view of history. But I'm thinking of that room with that long table, where Macron was, and it had 4 statues of 4 tsars. So the roots are very imperial. He himself has clearly read a lot of history, but in a very selective way. So I'm just wondering whether, at the time of perestroika, whether there were debates about Russia's Soviet Union history, Russia's history, that can serve as proxies for understanding what the mindsets were, and whether there's any scope for sort of doing some comparisons between then and now, and whether that could be an interesting way to look at. So it's just a very open-ended question.
Thank you. Let's so much to respond to. We will run over if that's all right. Because also, you'll be next. So, Kadri, you won't be able to respond to all of that. Also, but have a go.
Okay. Oh yeah, it is a lot. I maybe start from Heather. Well, Medvedev's years were actually 2008 to 2012. You're right. But I see Medvedev in retrospect a little bit differently, of course. He was appointed by Putin, and once I remember what made me think, Dmitry Trenin once said that Medvedev was Putin's attempt to see what can be achieved in cooperation with the West. And I think why Medvedev was forced to leave, it wasn't elite support that he lacked, it was Putin's support that he lacked. Putin just decided that he needs to come back. And I also wondered to what extent he really tried to reform the economy. He talked about it, but I think the one true legacy that he may have left, he created demand for a different Russia. I think that is true. I remember one of the bleakest times for me was 2006 or so, when free media and everything was still there. You had Echa Moskvy, Novaya Gazeta, plenty of other newspapers. Information was there, but there was no demand. I mean, people didn't want to read these newspapers. It contrasted so sharply with, perestroika period where everyone was queuing on Pushkin Square for Moskovsky Novosti. And I just felt that, you just don't want to know what's happening. But by 2011 and 12, that desire to read free media or, to have a say, to know what's happening, that had somehow come back. And I think Medvedev may have played some role. He might have been a Putin's puppet all along. But, what he said, it's sort of awakened kinds of desires among who felt that they had enough, that they had accumulated some wealth, and then they wanted dignity and democracy. Yeah. So, but can war economy deliver enough? I'm afraid it does. Right now. Sanctions. Let's see. The West seems to be stepping up secondary sanctions, so things will become tighter for Russia. But what effect it will have? But for now, Russia still can export oil, and there are multiple loopholes to smuggle consumer goods into Russia, or many of them can actually still even travel and buy. And I think what discredited Soviet Union was that people were not allowed outside and they had no money to buy. If now, we the West restrict Russians' access to our goods, that doesn't look as good as the other way. But of course, Russia remains vulnerable to external shocks. If oil price falls, that's a whole different story. But of course, the uncanny thing about Russia is that for some reason, the leaders who have been trying to do something democratic have been unlucky with oil price. Oil price under Yeltsin, I think, was like below $10 a barrel. And it started going up as soon as Putin came. I don't know. It really is uncanny. So, Rosa and Putin and history. That is interesting. I think I should have another look at debates about history in the Soviet Union. Because Putin, it is true that he has been reading history ever since actually something that I saw in the news, but I failed to attribute proper I failed to understand its full meaning. The Russian archive was brought under presidential administration in 2016. And one Western ambassador later told me how he had invited after that the archive director for dinner, asking, what does it mean for you? And he said that, well, that means we don't have monetary worries anymore. We have enough money for everything. And person number one is taking personal interest. So he has been reading history in a very selective manner, at least ever since 2016, if not earlier. But that's of course not the same as historical debates in society. What the reading I have done for research, it was striking how I had forgotten it. Russians were really concerned about Russian imperialism and chauvinism. That sort of kept coming up in debates in Russia, even more than in Estonia. We were afraid of Soviet crackdown rather than Russian imperialism or chauvinism. But Russians actually were afraid of sort of nationalist beast in Russia. And that was a lot debated. And of course, irony is that beast actually never bit. It may have barked, and also I think Putin kept nationalism under control. Putin is actually great power imperialist rather than Russian nationalist. You can see it in everything. And maybe now, only with the war in Ukraine and the sort of notion that Ukrainians don't exist, he has sort of opened the gates also to that sort of primitive sort of nationalism. Exactly, yes.
But he's still not a pure ethno-nationalist because he's multinational.
Yeah. Vaino, indeed. I mean, Russians keep telling me about Vaino. Head of administration, who is Estonian? of Soviet sort of communist heritage.
Very short remark to
Yeah.
Rosa's question. I think that Putin, he is obsessed by history, and of course he is using, I mean, for justification of practical political steps by historical reference, but there is also external aspect, because Russia is today only one state which is waging historic or memory wars with other states, and tries to force this state to accept the Russian interpretation of history concerning, I mean, these particular states, and if these states disagree, then Russia is punishing them, targeting them. It's a case of all Baltic states, Ukraine, Czech Republic, Poland, of course, even Bulgaria, this, I mean, this monument in Sofia. So it's absolutely unique example how Russia is employing history as a tool or even a weapon against other states.
But and Ivana's question, as I understand, is could it be that Russia actually changes all of us into thinking like Russia? Well, we certainly hope so. I mean, that is Putin's bet. That, you know, Western liberalism has fed up everyone, and people want to return to something, continue to something else. I don't think it will happen necessarily the way Putin imagines, but I think, you know, we are certainly in for some self-correction. I mean, the idea that we will impose democracy on everyone, everywhere, I think that is...
Okay, we're going to squeeze in Ivan and Christoph. Is that it? And then we can final remarks from you, Kadri, and then we will break for coffee.
Just a quick request to comment on
the motion of Shoigu.
Okay, and Christoph.
Good question. The perestroika failed, glasnost failed. And I wonder about the relationship between the two. But to put it more straightforwardly, in the economic side, producing only a few very, very big winners, but really only few, and producing a lot of losers. When how much of a role in your view did this play in actually prohibiting the sort of decent political system?
I think it did. I mean, unfair privatization was, I mean, that was one of the complaints I kept hearing. And really many other people were left with nothing to live on. And that really, plus of course the events of 1993. I mean, if you look at people like, I don't know, Igor Girkin and you know, the shady figures who later surfaced in Donbass, many of them actually had their political beginnings in the White House in 1993. They disappeared somewhere into obscurity in the meantime, but then they resurfaced, and it was clear that, you know, they had been formed there, and their political ideas had been fueling their activity ever since. So yeah, I do think it matters. You know, my basic takeaways from my time in Russia, one is don't prioritize personalities over process. I think Yeltsin election in 1996 was a wrong thing. We all supported Yeltsin over proper electoral procedures, and Russian journalists did the same. So, you know, my takeaway from that is that if you're a journalist, stick to truth. Don't think who benefits from the truth, etc. And another is people matter. You cannot be, you cannot say that, you know, we can sacrifice X number of people to, I don't know, starvation and poverty because we will reform the system. It doesn't work, likely. And even if it works, it's, I mean, it's not a deed you should engage in. And Shoigu and Patrushev, I think Shoigu was really demoted, yes. And that is possibly because, military failures and ineptness, etc. So in a way, Prigozhin got what he wanted with Shoigu's demotion. But that was, of course, executed not by Prigozhin, but by other people. I think Tatiana Stanovaya had a good short article about it, that Prigozhin was noisy, but FSB just kept collecting information and feeding it to Putin, and they got what they wanted. About Patrushev, I'm less sure. Was it demotion or was it something else? I think that Patrushev will always work as Patrushev, and it doesn't really matter where he is. Exactly. So I think his biggest influence comes from being sort of Putin's buddy. Yeah, possibly. But, Shoigu has never been close to Putin in the way that Patrushev is. And, maybe, it could be a comfortable retirement for him, and he's approaching retirement age anyway. But
we have to stop. I kept on remembering the title of a book, which you will know, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. I'm trying to remember the name of the author.
Yurchak, yes. Yes.
And that phrase kept on.
Yes.
That it was about the end of the Soviet. Everything was forever until it was no more. It was the last Soviet generation. They expected, and then suddenly it all ended. And that phrase kept on going through my mind. That possibly and hopefully that will also be the epitaph of the Putin regime. But thank you so much, Kadri, for a wonderful session.
Thank you.
Thank you.